FNS is one of professional Valorant's most well-respected players, and for good reason. His peak in 2022, with a Masters win, a top 3 finish, and a second place finish, cemented him as an all-time great. But the success that FNS found in 2022 also created massive expectations for him to live up to. And over time, in spite of the fact that the results visibly declined, the expectations for FNS never did. FNS was, in a way, burdened by the standards that his own success had created for him, and as that success began to dissipate, the player he was and the player he was believed to be diverged. But this diversion started long before his disastrous 2025 season. It can be traced all the way back to Champions 2023 against Billibilligaming. Unless you just started watching Valorant, you are likely already familiar with what happened here. The overwhelming favorite in NRG, a team composed of a championship-winning core that added a world-class smokes player, as well as one of the best players of 2022, is facing off against a team full of players that most of the Valorant community hasn't even heard of. And that's no disrespect to Bilibili. Valorant only officially launched in China less than a month before this series was played, and there was yet to be an official VCT league dedicated to the region. Thus, when the unfathomable happened and BLG not only won, but 2-0'd NRG, it was a huge shock. As the bracket played out, NRG would find themselves in a rematch with Bilibili, and NRG were favored once again, and seemed very confident going into the match.
We knew we were going to win. We knew we were going to win. Listen, we ain't losing to Zeta, you know what I mean? We ain't losing to Zeta, we ain't losing to Bilibili again. Trust me right now, we'll be in playoffs, and we're guaranteed, I promise you that.
To the surprise of everyone though, Bilibili took another 2-0 victory over NRG. But this time, it was different. It looked less like BLG was pulling off a shocking upset, and more like they were just the better team. NRG looked scrambled, FNS's mid-rounds were falling apart, and the frustration was visible, something rather unusual for a stoic and veteran IGL like FNS. And thus, that concluded NRG's 2023. By all accounts, it was a good year. Sure, they didn't win a trophy, but that could be said for every team that wasn't Fnatic or EG. A top 4 finish at Tokyo and a champs appearance, most teams would be overjoyed with a year like that. But not NRG, not this roster, and not FNS. Soon after, FNS would announce that he'd be taking a step back from competitive play. In his announcement, one line in particular stuck out. Quote, "I promise I'll be back to compete again." Even after a humiliating Champions 2023, there was still the belief that FNS could come back and ascend the ranks again. And he was abundantly clear with what it'd take for him to return. FNS wanted to create a roster around himself and Som that he could lead to another Masters win. But an opportunity like that just appearing seemed highly unlikely. A team would need to be performing poorly enough to consider making drastic changes, be willing to drop 2 players, including their IGL, to make room for FNS and Som, and have the money to pay these players. Genuinely, what were the odds of that happening? And just like that, FNS was back to competing and tasked with salvaging a disastrous year from NRG's failed super team project. He and Som would replace Demon 1 and Marved on the active roster, reuniting the two with crashies and Victor, as well as Ethan. And while the reunion made for a nice narrative and trip down memory lane, it was obvious that this iteration of NRG was always temporary. That's not to say that they were phoning it in, but FNS was clear about his intent to build his own roster, and this roster wasn't built by him. It's clear that FNS has nothing but the utmost respect for Victor and crashies as both friends and teammates, but at the same time, it felt obvious that FNS did not come back to competitive play to run it back with the same old core. That core had achieved great things, but ultimately it had run its course, and it was time for them to go their separate ways. The problem was, they still had an entire stage to get through. The second problem, they had to play in a group with Sentinels, G2, Crew, and Cloud9. They gave Sentinels a bit of a scare, were comfortably defeated by G2, and picked up a very important 2-1 win over a slumping crew that somehow kept their playoff hopes alive. Granted, a whole lot of other dominoes would need to fall for that to happen, but there was still some semblance of hope that this team could make playoffs and buy themselves a little more time to get things together. And it looked very likely to happen, as NRG would take a commanding 12-5 lead on map 3, Sunset. And then...
Gets another pick. Only 2 left alive here at Cloud9. And they're just spraying across it. Boom. Finally, Victor commits onto the defuse. The double play inside. A triple kill. As the battle comes up, the death split coming through. Not enough.
12-5 to 12-14 in the blink of an eye, as Cloud9 won 9 rounds in a row to end NRG's 2024 in very painful fashion. All NRG had to do was close out a 12-5 lead, and they could have kept their season alive. It was unbelievable for a veteran roster like this, led by FNS, to choke a seemingly insurmountable lead. But just like at Champions the year before, FNS looked flustered, NRG looked lost, and their year ended in tragic fashion. With that nightmare over though, FNS could finally transform NRG into the team that he had been dreaming of during his time away. He hand-selected Verno and Mata, the best 2 prospects from North American Challengers in 2024. Mata had been the best player statistically throughout all of 2024 on Moist X Shopify, and Verno had been one of the hottest prospects in Tier 2 for a while, with everyone basically just counting down the days until he was able to legally play in VCT. NRG would also replace Chet with Bonkar, a highly rated and sought-after coach who'd been working with Verno since 2023. On paper, this roster had huge amounts of potential if Mata and Verno played up to par. But the expectations for NRG were about to get astronomically higher, as prior to the 2025 season, FNS announced that this would be his last season competing. Now, the pressure was really on FNS to deliver a memorable final year. Not only did he assemble this roster himself, not only was he the IGL, but this being his last dance, so to speak, meant that it'd be all eyes on NRG, adding tons of additional pressure to perform. Sure, FNS said he wouldn't be treating the year any differently, but pressure comes from the outside too, and the community expected NRG to do big things to send FNS out on top. Thankfully though, things started off very well for this new look NRG, as they beat EG, C9, and Sentinels twice at the Sen City Classic. Verno and Mata were both top 3 rated players at the event. Granted, it was quite a small pool, but still, it looked promising. They would follow that up with a loss to Rapid Lo-Fi. Okay. They quickly got things together, sweeping through the rest of Soup League. Verno looked unreal during this tournament, posting the highest rating, 3rd highest ACS, and a 1.72 KD, an entire 0.30 higher than the 2nd highest KD at the tournament, 1.42 held by Flashback. But the real kicker, Flashback himself was also a statistical outlier. Safe to say, Verno was everything that everyone believed him to be, and it was abundantly clear why FNS had brought him into this project. FNS, after a disappointing 2023 and being handed an unsalvageable 2024, was finally in control on a roster that seriously felt like it could lift trophies. All in all, the offseason of NRG was very successful, and most people were penciling them in to make Masters Bangkok. So, imagine everyone's shock when they were instantly sent down to the lower bracket in 2-0 fashion by Cloud9. Sure, it was a close game, and sure, Zeppa had a godly performance averaging nearly 300 ACS across the series, but this NRG team looked destined for greatness after the offseason they'd had. And yet, here they were losing to a C9 team making buzzer-beater roster moves. They beat 100 Thieves to stay alive, but bowed out right after with a loss to Crew. Kickoff was extremely disappointing to say the least. The expectations after the offseason were incredibly high. FNS and NRG looked rejuvenated, and yet NRG would fall totally flat. Verno's performance slumped hard during Kickoff. It's not as though he was playing horribly, but he objectively underperformed, especially for his standards. Mata, meanwhile, actually looked fantastic, especially against 100 Thieves and crew. The most concerning part about Kickoff, though, was that the veterans on NRG were also underperforming. Ethan seemed to be regressing since his days on EG, and while Sam still looked sharp, the same could not be said for FNS, as his mechanical skill, which was already below average, seemed to take another step down. Statistically, FNS was the worst player at Kickoff to play a minimum of 100 rounds. While it wasn't unusual for FNS to be at the bottom statistically, it becomes a lot harder to justify once NRG is no longer winning. The game had been steadily evolving past the all-brain, no-aim IGL for a while, and if not even FNS could outbrain his subpar mechanics, who could? Within the span of just 1 month since Soup, NRG seemed to have taken a step back. Something was going wrong somewhere, but from the outside looking in, it wasn't clear exactly what it was, as there were multiple underperformers. But on February 11th, just a week after the team bombed out of Kickoff, NRG announced that both Verno and Bonkar would be moving to the inactive roster. This caught everyone off guard, as both Verno and Bonkar were highly sought after and exceptionally talented. Speculation began right away, as people attempted to piece together some sort of satisfying reason for the move. Eventually, FNS would state outright on the NRG podcast that Verno wasn't the right fit with the team, and that though there was an attempt made to remedy the issues and rift that had formed with Verno, it just wasn't working out. The real question on many people's minds, though, was why NRG decided to also bench Bonkar. In his tweet announcing his benching, Bonkar would say, quote, "We did not have the same vision when it came to the roster," which implies a bit of a deeper disconnect than the comms and personality issues that caused Verno to be dropped. Many took this to mean that Bonkar simply wasn't willing to stay on a team without Verno, and thus he benched himself, which kind of makes sense when considering the history between the two. However, months later, we'd get a bit more clarification on this entire situation from T-Dog, of all people. According to him, things fell apart when Bonkar wanted to bench FNS. However, quote, 2 individuals on the team decided that they wouldn't play unless FNS remained on the team. This meant that it was either FNS and his 2 mystery friends, or Verno and Bonkar who had to go. Of course, this information is to be taken with a grain of salt, but given there hasn't been any official reason for Bonkar's benching, and he's currently back with the team, it's not really that far-fetched. Their replacements would be announced just 5 days later, as Brock and Mike's HD would be brought in to fill the void. Brock was the second best initiator in North American Challengers, who honestly had been Tier 1 ready for quite a while. The real concern, though, was Mike's HD. Not because Mike's was a terrible coach, but swapping your coach and thereby your entire system is much more of a drastic change than swapping a single player. Now, after all that turmoil, you might be thinking, surely all the hope that NRG fans had for this season had been stomped out. But in spite of roster and coaching changes, many still thought that NRG could make it work, that their kickoff performance was a fluke, and that they'd return to off-season form in Stage 1. They opened the stage against Cloud9 and dominated on the first map. For a moment, it looked like maybe the decision to drop Verno was the right one, as Brock looked amazing, as did the rest of NRG. Once they got off their map pick, though, things took a big downturn, and once again, NRG would lose to Cloud9. Obviously, they didn't have a lot of time to prepare, and after picking up a win over Furia, they had a shred of momentum, something they hadn't had since the offseason. With a little more time under their belt, it was time to see what they were really made of in Week 3 against G2.
Seconds left, and a double peak forwards anyway, 4 seconds remaining, barely getting onto it, you somehow, no way, man, Valorant.
And there really isn't any way to sugarcoat this. G2 absolutely humiliated NRG. If anyone had any hope left that NRG could go blow for blow with the true contenders in their region, this pretty much put those hopes to rest. A 13-1, followed by what could have been a 13-2, if not for a miracle clutch by FNS. If that wasn't bad enough, the humiliation of NRG would continue into Week 4, as they squared off with Verno and MIBR. Verno torched them, finishing +20 across 2 maps, as MIBR took the series handily. And to make NRG's decision to drop him look even more silly, Verno seemed to be meshing extremely well with MIBR, as his entire team would sing his praises, especially when it came to his communication skills. In weeks 3 and 4, NRG won 19 rounds total. 19 rounds. Across 2 entire matches, 4 entire maps, 19 rounds. Sure, they beat a limp Leviathan to squeak into the playoffs, but as expected, they went out right away. For the 3rd time in a row, FNS would go out with a whimper. A 2-0 loss to 100 Thieves, and that was that. The end of FNS's career. There's a saying in traditional sports that Father Time is undefeated. And while it's traditionally used to describe the literal breaking down of the bodies of athletes, it has a place in esports too, but more so to describe how the game itself changes and grows over time, and how that impacts players. Valorant has evolved a ton, not just meta shifts or new maps, but entirely new ideas about macro approaches to the game. We literally just saw a team with no dedicated IGL win a Masters tournament. On the micro level, just like traditional sports, the baseline skill level of players increases over time as well. It only makes sense that as time passes, newer and better players will phase out older players that have already reached their peak. In my opinion, that's what happened to FNS. It's not that his calling suddenly sucked and he lost his game IQ, and while his mechanics did take a step back, he was never a strong fragger anyways. His calling was just so ahead of most IGLs in 2021 and 2022 that it didn't matter if he could aim. Eventually, a new wave of IGLs arrived on the scene, and they could shoot. Thus, the advantage that FNS gave you gradually started to dwindle. And once those new IGLs got stage and big match experience, well, that's when FNS's fragging would become a detriment. He couldn't simply outcall the opposing team's IGL consistently like he used to be able to. Eventually, some of those new wave IGLs were outcalling him, and his lack of fragging ability had an even brighter spotlight shined on it. The game simply evolved past the type of player that FNS is, and that's okay. Esports careers are so short and so volatile that a lengthy and successful run like FNS's is something to be praised and a blueprint to be followed. Even as other players in IGLs collect more accolades and achievements, FNS's impact on the game is truly hard to match.